we've all seen A Nightmare on Elm Street. Freddy Kruger, the caretaker with the finger knives, he was accused by the parents of being a paedophile, and they burnt him alive. He then came back and haunted the children of the parents who killed him, killing the children. What if I told you he was real? In West Virginia in 1991, a young family known as the Kendalls, that was the father Brian, the mother Belinda, Blair and Sean, their daughter and son respectively. They decided to move into a cabin off in the woods outside of Slanesville. They were a young family living in Baltimore, Maryland, and they'd grown sick of the city life, decided to move back home to the country roads of West Virginia. You see what I did there? Anyway, Brian, he was a carpenter by trade. He still worked his job in Maryland, so he'd have to do a commute of a few hours at least every day. And Slanesville was a small place with a population just shy of about 200, I think. It was a single floor cabin, completely surrounded by forest and completely isolated. Brian and Belinda they lived in a pretty rough area. They didn't like sending their kids out to play that often, at least not without supervision. It was for fear of their safety, and the cabin's isolation was a good thing for them. They felt more free to let the kids wander, and less likely to worry in doing such. Brian also went out and got a black lab called Coco. This was to act as a family pet and security dog, guard dog. The family absolutely adored Coco, quickly became the family's new member, took her place as the protector of the family as well. She was very protective over all of them, especially the kids. The Kendalls quickly settle into Slanesville. They're getting used to their new lives in peace and isolation. That's how it started anyway. So the family have unpacked and settled in, and Belinda had her brother and his wife and their daughter come visit the new place. And as a little surprise, Belinda was going to throw a small party for her niece Jordan, because Jordan just had her birthday before coming to the visit, basically. So Belinda was a sweet woman, so she sets up some balloons, a cake and some little games for the kids. And the party comes, the cake's been cut, kids have finished, they're in the living room playing a game, all the adults are in the kitchen, joined, and they're having coffee, catching up, and then they sort of start to notice something wrong. The kids are taking all the balloons into one end of the room, and they're on the other end. The balloons are up on the ceiling, the strings are hanging down. What they notice is that one of the balloon strings was taut. It was dead straight. The rest are all sort of hanging limp. They sort of, one by one, they all start off. The balloon was floating across the room, still taut, floated to the centre of the room and stopped. The kids were all playing on the other side of the room, they hadn't really noticed. But the adults were transfixed. It just continued to float and float and float. And it came to rest right in front of Belinda's niece Jordan. And Jordan noticed the balloon and said thank you. It's a bit weird. That's what the parents thought anyway. So she reached out, took the balloon, and it floated back up to the ceiling before she could get it. She was sort of, went back to the game. The adults were a lot more shocked than she was. They could have understood if like the helium had leaked out a bit and it sunk down, but then it wouldn't float back up. Maybe the wind blew it over, but again, sinking down then rising back up wouldn't work. And who was the little girl talking to? So the parents all go into the living room. They're questioning what they'd seen and try reenacting what had happened. They pulled the balloon down and let it go, and they were dumbfounded basically. They went to Jordan and asked who she'd spoken to. She was about 2 or 3 years old, and she sort of, huh? Who? When the balloon floated down to you, sweetie, who were you talking to? She was like, oh, him. And the adults all sort of look over and they're like, oh right, yeah, him, yeah. It's just a kid. Their imagination, we're freaking ourselves out, it's nothing. We're gonna get on with the night, forget about it. And the rest of the night they have a good time catching up. Then Belinda's brother and his sister, brother and his wife, the family, they go home, and Brian and Belinda are sort of cleaning up after everything, and they sort of went, oh, that was strange, wasn't it? That was all of it. They just put it to the back of their minds other than that. Until a couple of days later, when Brian and his daughter went exploring around the forest near the house. Brian's been working hard, doing a lot of long commutes back and forth every day, and he's overdue some family time, and he wants to get to know the land. So they're in the woods behind their home, and they're both really excited because Blair's about 4 or 5, I think, and she was excited to get out too. So anyway, they go into the woods, they get a little way in, and they sort of see something off in the distance, and as I would have done, they went and investigated. What they found was a burnt out van, totally charred with pretty much nothing left but the frame. They go around the back of the van, and inside they see the remains of burnt stuffed animals, like just little bits of them, some kids' toys, and a burnt mattress, nothing else. Heavily rusted, charred springs, that's all. Yeah, we can all guess what happened in there. Brian could tell too, and he didn't want his kid being around that, so he was like, let's go look for something else, this is boring. And later when they got back, he told his wife about the van. They sort of wondered how it got there, why all the weird stuff was inside, what it was all about. I mean, the mattress in the panel van with stuffed toys, all that's missing is a bag of sweets, so it's kind of obvious. After a couple of months, Brian had begun to struggle with the daily commute. That he'd eat hours of his day up. It'd leave him lacking sleep, and it seemed irrational, and therefore he decided while he was working in the week, he'd stay at his mum's house and then come back for the weekends. It'd be hard, but they'd make it work. The only trouble for Belinda here was that they only had one car, so Belinda wouldn't have any transport during the week, but this wasn't really a problem for her. She'd grown up in this sort of isolated environment. She'd make do. Anyway, Blair's dying to go out and camp one night, and there's this camper they have parked in their property. She'd been begging for ages and ages to go and spend one night out just by herself in the scary camper. So one day, after probably being bombarded about it constantly, as kids do, Belinda finally caves and says, fine, you can sleep in there. She felt the kids were cooped up and probably getting a bit cabin fever, but she wasn't like, hey, let's do this, about the idea. She was a bit so she agreed that she'd let her go out, but you keep it locked all night and the dog stays with you. which is fair enough. Pretty much what I'd say. Blair spends some time, gets some more clothes, a lantern to read with, a few books to read, I'd guess. Grabs a blanket and that, gets the dog, and then Belinda and Blair go out to the camper. Belinda gets Blair settled in for the night, dog settled on the bed, they say goodnight, she leaves, the door's locked. Most of the camper's space was taken up by a small pull-out bed that Blair and Coco were sleeping on, and to the right of the bed was a long window with a blackout curtain she kept closed. That's a blind, that's a curtain. Anyway, she kept it closed across the window. At the foot of the bed near the window, down on the right, was the door to the camper. Sorry, at the foot of the bed was the door to the camper. That didn't have a blind or a curtain on it though. And it had quite a big window on it. Anyway, after a while of reading, Blair gets tired, puts the book down, turns the lantern off, and gets settled in bed. She goes to sleep hugging the Labrador. But at some point in the night, she wakes up because Coco is acting strange. She's looking at the door, kind of uneasy, hackles her up. Blair, she's a bit freaked out, but she tries to calm Coco down. She can sort of see just out of the door, there's some moonlight breaking through, and she sees someone dart past the tray of the door. Blair wasn't sure what she'd seen. It could have been an animal or a person, she doesn't know, but she'd definitely seen something. And Coco had seen it too. She started growling as soon as it ran past, but instead of fixing on the door, she fixed on the window to the right of the bed. Blair thought it was her mum. So she calls out, nothing, tries to calm the dog down, turns the lantern back on, and goes to the door. Looks out the window, can't see anything. So she unlocks the door and peeks out, can't see her mum, so she's, "Mum?" Quietly calls out, no response. She looks up at the house and it's pitch black and quiet. There's no sign that her mum has come out to check on her. And Blair starts to feel really, really scared. She slams the door shut, locks it, and again goes and gets back into bed. But Coco is still on the bed, staring at the covered window. And now she's gone from like a throaty growl to a full-on snarl with bare teeth. The kid's terrified, and she dives under the covers, starts praying that the dog will stop, wants it all to end. But then she thinks, maybe it is my mum. And little Blair gets up and goes over to the window to check. She's still spooked, but she goes over. She stays low, tucks herself against the wall, and peels the curtain back just a little bit so she can peek her eye through. She saw a dark figure stood right against the window, looking into the camper. She was absolutely terrified. She got straight back under the covers, with Coco stood right over her, protecting her. The dog's basically saying, "You are not getting anywhere near her before you go through me." And it takes Blair a long, long time, but she falls asleep. Anyway, back in the house, Belinda has been having trouble getting her youngest Sean to sleep. It's really strange because he's always been a really good sleeper, except for tonight. He just would not settle down. Despite the fact that Belinda put Sean down not long after he come back in from the camper, The 3-year-old was, as I said, great sleeper. You put him down, you wouldn't see him till the next morning. But that night, Sean just wouldn't settle. Several times through the night, Sean complained to his mum that he did not want to be in the room. Belinda was patient and had actually put him back to bed several times before asking, "Why don't you want to go to sleep in the room?" "There's a monster in my window, Mummy." Belinda's now assuming that this is just a deer or some animal that's run past and scared the son. So she goes over to the window and looks out. All she can see is darkness and forests. Belinda spent a while just trying to calm Sean down, gets him to settle. He explains that it's only an animal that lives in the woods, like a deer, maybe a moose. And he accepts this and goes off to sleep. The next morning, the little girl Blair is so relieved to wake up and see the light shining in through the camper windows. She goes back to the main house, Coco following closely behind, and joins her mum and brother at the breakfast table. Blair is 5, so when her mum asked how she slept, how her night was, camping out in the camper, she found it unusual that Blair was just quiet. She didn't really say anything. She asked if she'd had fun, but Blair just said she didn't want to go camping again. Belinda didn't really want to push, just assumed that she wasn't into camping, so she let it drop. That same night, Blair and Sean were in their beds. Belinda decides to do the same. She locks everything down and goes to sleep. She had a dream. She wakes up in bed, lying down. She sees a little boy at the end of the bed. She didn't recognise him. He was probably around Sean's age. He was waving for her to follow him. So she did. She followed him out the front door. It's daylight out, and there are washing lines strung all across the garden. It's her house, but there were just washing lines everywhere, and white sheets. Sounds like a John Woo film. Anyway, there's white sheets strung up everywhere, and she's making her way through it, trying to keep up with this kid. She can't see him anymore. He started through too quick. She's forcing her way through the sheets, trying to find him, and she feels something on her right foot. It's a clothes peg. She pulls it off of her toe and then wakes up. She's really confused, in a haze, but realised it was just a dream. She goes back to sleep and wakes up the next morning, gets out of bed, goes about her business and makes her bed. And then on the floor beside her bed, it's a clothes peg, like the one from her dream. Exactly like it. Only the family don't own any clothes pegs. They don't even have a clothesline, so there's no logical reason for it to be there. It freaked her out, so being freaked out, Belinda decided to talk with her sister. She tells her about the dream she's had, then about finding the clothes peg in the morning. Her sister's reply is a fair assumption that she's been alone, stuck in the house with the kids. She herself is actually getting cabin fever and needs a bit of time alone. So she says, "I'll come look after the kids. You take a day to yourself, get your mind clear, relax." So her sister comes over, takes the kids for her, and Belinda decided that what she would do is go and explore, as Brian and Blair had done. So she went out into the forest, behind the house. Belinda gets a little way into the forest, spots a few objects off in the distance, so heads over to check it out as you do. When she gets over, she can see 4 graves in a row. She thinks by the size of them that they're probably the graves of children, although she can't tell because they're unmarked. There's a headstone, it's just not, there's no writing on it. This was right near their cabin, so it could have been on their property. I'm not sure. But again, it freaked Belinda out, so she decided to head back. A few days later, Blair is asleep in her room, but she wakes up feeling uneasy and decides something's awry. So Blair starts looking around, but something's out of place. She can't work it out. Normally she keeps her windows shut with the curtains down. Again, down. Open. Closed. That's the one. Closed. She keeps her curtains closed. So you get a bit of comedy with me. So yeah, she keeps her curtains closed, but tonight they are wide open. So she gets up, goes over to the curtains, but as I look out, as she's there, and she instantly regretted it, bless her. Out in the tree line, she could see a shadowy figure. It was getting closer to her. Slowly. Until she noticed it. And then it got a lot faster. It was sprinting at her across the clearing towards the house. And it terrified Blair. So she pulled the curtain shut, retreated under her covers, pulling them over the head. And meanwhile, in Belinda's room, Coco is going absolutely nuts. She's barking, staring at the window. This wakes Belinda up and she looks over to where the dog's looking at. Checks out the window, can't see anything. So, just assumes it's a deer or a dog or something. A deer or an animal that spooked the dog out. So she tells Coco, chill out, there's nothing there. But Belinda decides go check on Blair and Sean because parenting. First she checked on Sean, fast asleep. Then she went in and checked on Blair, who was still under her covers, absolutely scared, out of her mind. So she's like, Blair, sweetie, what's up? Why are you so scared? Blair tells her she saw something out of the window, and it scared her. That there was a person running at the house. Belinda's still thinking this is an animal, but Blair's seen probably the same animal that Sean had seen and thought it was a monster before. Being short, the creature was terrifying her dogs and kids and her dog, sorry. It was just Bambi. She tells Blair not to worry about it and to go to sleep. There's nothing to worry about. But eventually she does go back to sleep herself, and not long after she's asleep with her back to the door, she's awoken by a tapping on her head, without looking, she just keeps her eyes closed and said, there's nothing to be scared of, sweetie, just go back to sleep. A few moments, and then tap 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 on her head again. She rolls over this time, goes to tell her kid okay, it's fine, don't worry. Opens her eyes and there's no one there. But Coco is stood over her now, growling at the exact space where the tapping had come from. So immediately she gets up, turns the light on, and sees nothing in the room. She goes, checks on the kids again. They're both sound asleep. She checks the house. It's still locked. There's no one. There's no way anyone could have stuck in. It's secure. But now she's sat in bed and she's trying to rationalise as hard as she can. But she's still scared of everything from Jordan's party, Brian and Blair finding the van, the monster her son had seen, the graveyard she'd found. It had all got to her and it was starting to genuinely scare her for the first time. She even stated in interviews that this was the first time she'd even connected the word haunted with her cabin. The next day, Belinda determined she was going to go out. She was set on it. So she calls up her mum and asks if she could borrow the car for the day. Her mum had no problem with that. So she came, dropped off the car, I'm assuming got her left off with Belinda's dad or something. Anyway, they all got into Belinda's mum's car, strapped up, heading into town. They left the house under the protection of Coco, who was in a cage outside. Secure, locked up, safe. Anyway, the family head out for the day. They're fueling up at a gas station, as you'd call it in America. Anyway, there's a woman stood alongside who's also fueling up the car. They get talking, and at some point the woman says she doesn't recognise Belinda. It's quite a small town, like I said, around 200 people. Asks where she's from. So Belinda tells her, we're tucked in the back of the woods off this road, and the woman's like, oh, you know the history of the property? And Belinda didn't have a clue. So she's like, oh, well, a few years back there'd been a bad fire around your property and our whole family died. And that's the graveyard in Belinda's mind again. And she said, actually, I found these unmarked graves the other day on our property. On the edge. Not sure. Anyway, they part ways. Belinda is driving and she gets this feeling of relief now because she feels like it's not a mystery anymore. She has some closure and is now considering that if her house is in fact haunted by these beings, that they're not malevolent or evil or out to do harm. It's just a family, a nice family. So it can't be anything bad. It never felt malicious to her or like there was a sad feeling, so she felt relaxed about it. More that it was a sad feeling, sorry. She felt bad for him, the family. Anyway, they returned home and found Coco gone. They went over, checked the fence. There was no sign that anyone had broken in or that the dog had dug out or squeezed through a gap or anything. She was just gone. And that morning was the last time they'd ever see their beloved pet. It was a crushing blow for the whole family. Coco was like another child. It was only the only protection they had in the week. And now they felt their dog was just gone and they were alone. It's probably a horrible feeling in that situation especially. A few days later, Brian's back home and everyone is in bed except for Belinda, who stayed up watching TV late. Eventually she calls it a night and heads to bed. She woke up with the boy at the end of her bed again. She knew she was dreaming, so she follows the boy outside and starts following through all the sheets across the lawn, and she reaches a small clear section where this boy, around Sean's age, is stood at the opposite edge of the clearing looking towards her. The boy looks absolutely terrified and he's looking off to his left at something, trying to get her to look at it as well. And then this great shadowy figure emerges, bearing in mind it's daytime, and the figure walks over, stands by the boy, looking at Belinda, and then starts moving towards her. At this point, she falls backwards, wakes up as she hits the ground. She can hear the screams, so her and Brian leap out of bed, run into Sean's room, find the poor little boy lying on the floor with his arm cocked back behind his head, and they can tell it's broken by how it is and how he's like defending it and screaming. So the parents tell him, calm down, tell us what happened, and eventually he does. He says, the monster came in my window. Poor little tyke. Anyway, they have no idea what happened. They're trying to work out whether someone's broken in just to hurt the kid, but they can't find anyone. They don't know anything, really. It's something that happened. So they take him to hospital. They don't hang around long, they head straight there. Doctors tell the family it's pretty significant and they'll have to keep him in the hospital for a few days. And Brian had to go to work the next day, so Belinda was left alone without the car. Came to the time to collect their son, so she borrowed her mum's car again. Belinda and Blair head over, collect Sean, and on the way home, Belinda's mum's car breaks down. So they're at the roadside waiting for help, and a friendly local old lady pulls over and asks, do you want some help? And they're going to be waiting for ages, so they're like, yeah, sure, thank you, that's really gracious of you. So they're heading back and Belinda's telling the lady where to go, And she's like, oh, I know that place. Have you heard the history? And Belinda's like, oh yeah, the fire, right? Yeah. And Ollie's, oh, I don't know about any old fire, but I heard talk that there was a man who'd lived there. And the talk of Slanesville was this guy, he hurt children, if you catch my drift. And a group of men decided that this man, they need to do something. So the mob told the man to go hunting with them, somewhere out behind the Kendall's cabin. At some point, they ambushed the guy, and he was never seen again. It's rumoured they beat him up, tied him up, left him in the back of a van out in the woods, which they set on fire. Sounds pretty familiar. So Belinda's now scared again because she's sure their house is haunted, but instead of it being this sad presence of a family, it's this horrible man who took joy in hurting kids. She'd already had her son hurt, and as far as she could tell, it might happen again. So they got home, phoned Brian, told him he had to come back, and they would not spend another night in that home. Brian comes back, packs the bags, and they never went back to the cabin. That was it. So thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, like and subscribe. I'll keep uploading as often as I can. It's been a little while for these ones, but thank you for your wait. Also follow my other channel, Exploring with Ike and Varga. Me and my friends go exploring abandoned buildings, caves, bunkers, military bases and the like, so check it out. Thanks.